Sometimes the deepest pain comes wrapped in the smallest packages. For Josiah Hartwell, Christmas Eve 1879 would prove that even the most broken hearts can still recognize the call of family. The mountain man had lived alone in the wilderness for 15 years, avoiding people and bearing his grief in silence. His weathered hands had forgotten human kindness. His heart closed off after losing everything that mattered. But on this snowy Christmas Eve, something would change. Behind the town saloon, a little girl searched through trash for food. She was thin, dirty, and shivering in the cold. When Josiah found her, he had no idea she would turn his world upside down. The child wasn't just any orphan. She was family he never knew existed. What would this discovery mean for a man who had given up on everything? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The wind howled through the pine trees like the voices of the dead, carrying with it the scent of snow and the promise of a harsh winter night. Josiah Hartwell pulled his worn leather coat tighter around his shoulders as he made his way down the narrow mountain path toward Cedar Ridge. His boots crunched through the fresh powder that had begun falling an hour ago, each step deliberate and sure despite the gathering darkness. At 53, Josiah carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who had learned to depend on no one but himself. His beard, more gray than brown now, was neatly trimmed, a small concession to civilization that he maintained even in his self-imposed exile. His eyes, the color of winter sky, held depths that spoke of sorrows carefully guarded and memories deliberately buried. The town below flickered with warm lamplight, each window a reminder of the life he had once known and chosen to abandon. Cedar Ridge had grown smaller over the years as the railroad pushed further west, taking with it the dreams of prosperity that had once drawn settlers to this remote corner of Colorado territory. What remained was a stubborn collection of weathered buildings and weathered people clinging to the mountainside like barnacles on a ship's hull. Josiah's cabin sat 3 miles up the mountain, tucked into a grove of aspens where the wind sang different songs depending on the season. He had built it himself in those first terrible months after everything changed. The structure was solid, functional, designed to withstand the harsh mountain winters and the occasional curious bear. Inside, it was sparse but comfortable. A stone fireplace that dominated one wall, a sturdy table he had crafted from pine, shelves lined with the few books he had saved, and in the far corner, a trunk he never opened. The trunk held remnants of his former life, a life that had ended abruptly on a spring morning 15 years ago, when the mountain had claimed the only things that mattered to him. Anna, his wife of 22 years, with her gentle hands and patient smile. David, their son, barely 19 and full of dreams about the future. They had been traveling to visit Anna's sister in Denver when the avalanche struck. Josiah had been in town that day, conducting business, arguing with the bank manager about loan payments. If he had been with them, he would have died too. Instead, he lived with the knowledge that his last words to David had been sharp and impatient, spoken in frustration about the boy's plans to marry young Catherine Mills. Now, 15 years later, Josiah survived by trapping and hunting, trading pelts and meat to the townsfolk who had long since stopped trying to draw him into their community. He was known simply as the Mountain Man, a figure more legend than flesh, glimpsed occasionally on the streets of Cedar Ridge before disappearing back into the wilderness like smoke. Doc Morrison, the town's physician and one of the few people Josiah still spoke to regularly, often worried aloud about the hermit's state of mind. "A man needs companionship," he would say during Josiah's infrequent visits. "Isolation isn't natural for our kind." But Josiah had learned that companionship meant vulnerability, and vulnerability meant the possibility of loss so devastating. It could break a soul beyond repair. Sheriff Callahan, a decent man with tired eyes, occasionally checked on Josiah during his rounds, more out of duty than suspicion. The mountain man had never caused trouble, never broken laws, never given anyone reason to complain. He paid his debts, kept to himself, and asked nothing of anyone. Murphy, who ran the saloon that served as the town's unofficial community center, often joked that Josiah was more reliable than the seasonal weather. You can count on seeing him. Every 2 weeks, Murphy would tell his customers, in and out like a ghost, trades his goods, buys his supplies, and disappears again. Never seen a man so determined to avoid human contact. But contact was unavoidable in a town as small as Cedar Ridge. People nodded when they saw him. Some still attempted conversations he politely deflected, and a few of the older residents remembered him from before, when he had been a man entirely. Before the tragedy, Josiah had been active in community affairs, known for his carpentry skills and his willingness to help neighbors in need. Anna had taught at the small schoolhouse, and David had been courting Catherine Mills, the daughter of the town's former mayor. The transformation had been as complete as it was heartbreaking. Within weeks of the funeral, Josiah had sold his house in town, loaded what possessions he could carry into a wagon, and disappeared into the mountains. For months, people assumed he had left the territory entirely. Then Murphy spotted him at the edge of town one evening, trading furs for coffee and ammunition. The mountain man was born that night, though it would be years before anyone dared call him by that name to his face. His daily routine had become as predictable as the sunrise. He rose before dawn, checked his trap lines, tended to the small garden that provided vegetables through the warmer months, and performed the countless maintenance tasks that mountain living demanded. In the afternoons, he read books about history, philosophy, and science that he had collected over the years. In the evenings, he carved small figures from wood, a skill Anna had always admired and encouraged. The carvings accumulated in a basket beside his chair, though he rarely looked at them once completed. They were simply a way to keep his hands busy while his mind wandered through memories he could not escape, and futures he would not allow himself to imagine. Tonight was different, though. Christmas Eve had always been difficult. Too many memories of Anna's excitement as she prepared special meals and wrapped gifts in brown paper tied with string. David's laughter echoing through their small house as he helped his mother with decorations made from pine branches and colorful fabric scraps. The last Christmas they had celebrated together, David had announced his engagement to Catherine, and Anna had cried with joy, while Josiah grumbled about the boy being too young for such responsibilities. The irony was not lost on him now. David had been the same age Josiah was when he married Anna, but parental perspective had a way of making 19 seem impossibly young and naive. If he could have that conversation again, he would have embraced his son and welcomed Catherine into their family with the grace Anna had always demonstrated. As he reached the outskirts of Cedar Ridge, Josiah pulled his hat lower over his eyes and quickened his pace. The sooner he completed his business, the sooner he could return to the solitude of his mountain retreat. He needed coffee, flour, and bullets for his rifle. Murphy would have everything he required, and the transaction would be completed with minimal conversation. The saloon glowed with warm light, and he could hear the murmur of voices from within. Lonely men seeking companionship on Christmas Eve, sharing stories and whiskey while the snow fell outside. Josiah had no desire to join them, but he understood the impulse. Loneliness was a constant companion in these mountains, though he had long since made peace with its presence. He circled around to the back of the building where Murphy kept supplies for his regular customers. The alley was dark and quiet, lit only by the spill of light from the saloon's windows. Snow was falling more heavily now, muffling sound and creating a sense of isolation even in the heart of town. That's when he saw her, a small figure crouched beside the wooden barrel where Murphy discarded kitchen scraps and refuse. At first, Josiah thought it might be a stray dog or perhaps a young deer driven down from the mountains by hunger. But as he moved closer, he realized it was a child, a little girl, maybe 8 or 9 years old, digging through the garbage with thin, desperate fingers. She wore a ragged dress that had once been blue, now faded to the color of winter sky. Her dark hair hung in matted tangles around a face that was streaked with dirt and tears. In her small hands, she clutched a crust of bread like it was the most precious thing in the world. Josiah stopped, his breath forming clouds in the cold air. For a moment, he considered turning away, pretending he hadn't seen her. Other people's problems were not his responsibility, and he had learned that involvement led only to heartache. But something about the child's posture, the way she hunched, her shoulders against the cold, the careful way she examined each scrap before deciding whether it was edible, struck him with unexpected force. "Child," he said softly, not wanting to startle her. She looked up with eyes that were too old for her young face, too knowing for someone who should still believe in the magic of Christmas Eve. Her gaze met his without fear, but with a wariness that spoke of hard experiences and harsh lessons. "I'm not doing anything wrong," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Mr. Murphy said I could look through the scraps." Josiah felt something shift inside his chest, like ice beginning to crack after a long winter. The sensation was both familiar and terrifying, an echo of the man he had been before grief transformed him into something harder and more solitary. "What's your name?" he asked, moving closer but keeping his movements slow and non-threatening. "Nora," she replied, clutching the bread crust tighter. "Nora Hartwell." The world seemed to stop. The falling snow suspended itself in the air. The voices from the saloon faded to silence, and Josiah felt the ground shift beneath his feet as if the mountain itself was moving. Hartwell. She had said Hartwell. His throat constricted, and for a moment he couldn't speak. When he finally found his voice, it came out rough and uneven. "Hartwell, you said?" The little girl nodded, studying his face with those two knowing eyes. "Yes, sir. My mama was Catherine Hartwell before she died. She used to tell me stories about the mountains and about my grandpa who lived up there all alone. She said he was sad, but that he was good people." Josiah's knees nearly buckled. Catherine Mills, Catherine Hartwell now apparently, had been David's intended bride. If this child was telling the truth, if she was Catherine's daughter, then she was— "How old are you, Nora?" he managed to ask. 9 last October, she said. "Mama died in the spring. Been on my own since then mostly. 9 years old, which meant she had been born about 8 years after David and Catherine should have married. 8 years after the avalanche that had claimed his son's life. But if Catherine had married someone else, taken the Hartwell name—" "Your father," Josiah said carefully. "What was his name?" "David," she said simply. "David Hartwell. Mama said he died before I was born, in an accident up in the mountains. She said he was your son." The words hit Josiah like a physical blow. He staggered backward, his hand reaching out to steady himself against the side of the building. David had lived. Somehow, impossibly, his son had survived the avalanche, had married Catherine, had become a father, and Josiah had never known. Little girl, his granddaughter, watched him with concern. "Are you all right, mister? You look like you've seen a ghost." "I have," Josiah whispered, barely able to speak past the emotions threatening to overwhelm him. "I believe I have." The snow continued to fall around them, creating a curtain of white that seemed to separate them from the rest of the world. Josiah stared at the child, at Nora, his mind struggling to process what she had told him. His granddaughter, David's daughter. The family he had never known existed. "You're him, aren't you?" Nora said, her voice small but steady. "You're my grandpa Josiah." He nodded, not trusting his voice. The simple acknowledgement felt like stepping off a cliff, abandoning the careful isolation he had maintained for 15 years. "Mama said you might not want to see me," Nora continued, shifting the bread crust from one hand to the other. "She said you were hurt real bad when Papa died, and that hurt sometimes makes people want to be alone." "Your mother, Catherine, she's gone?" Josiah asked, though he already knew the answer from the way the child spoke of her. "Died of the fever last spring," Nora said matter-of-factly, though her lower lip trembled slightly. We were living in a little house outside Leadville. Mama worked as a seamstress when she could get the work. After she passed, the landlord said I had to leave. Been moving around since then, trying to get by. The casual way she spoke of such hardships broke something loose inside Josiah's chest. This child had been wandering alone for months, surviving on scraps and the kindness of strangers, while he had been wallowing in his grief just miles away. How did you end up in Cedar Ridge? He asked. Mama told me stories about this place, about Papa growing up here, and about you living somewhere, up in the mountains. She said if anything ever happened to her, I should try to find you, said family was the most important thing, even when it seemed broken. Nora reached into the collar of her ragged dress and pulled out a small silver locket on a tarnished chain. She gave me this before she died, said it belonged to Papa's mama, to Anna, said it would prove who I was if I ever found you. Josiah's breath caught. Anna's locket. He had given it to her on their wedding day, and she had worn it every day until he had buried it with her, or thought he had. But perhaps David had kept it, given it to Catherine when they married. With trembling fingers, he took the locket from Nora and opened it. Inside was a tiny photograph of Anna, young and smiling, her hair arranged in the style she had favored when they were first married. On the other side was a lock of hair, David's hair cut when he was just a baby. Dear God, Josiah whispered, his vision blurring. It's really her locket. Mama said Anna was the kindest woman who ever lived, Nora said softly. She said Anna would have loved me if she'd ever gotten the chance to meet me. The simple statement nearly undid him completely. Anna would have adored this child, would have spoiled her with attention and filled her with stories and laughter. She would have been the grandmother every child deserved. You're cold, Josiah said, suddenly noticing how the child was shivering despite her attempts to hide it. And hungry. I'm managing, Nora said with a dignity that reminded him painfully of Anna. I don't want to be a burden on anybody. You're not a burden, Josiah said firmly. You're family. The word felt strange on his tongue after so many years of solitude, but also strangely right. Family. He had a granddaughter. David's daughter was alive, standing in front of him, needing care and protection. Come with me, he said, making a decision that terrified and exhilarated him in equal measure. There's a storm coming and you need shelter. Are you sure? Nora asked, hope flickering in her dark eyes. I don't eat much and I can help with chores. Mama taught me how to cook and clean and mend things. I'm sure, Josiah said, though his heart was pounding with uncertainty. He hadn't shared his space with another person in 15 years. Didn't know if he remembered how to care for someone else, especially a child. But this wasn't just someone else. This was David's daughter, his own blood. Wait here, he told her. I need to get my supplies from Murphy. He entered the saloon. Through the back door, his mind reeling with the implications of what had just happened. Murphy looked up from where he was wiping down glasses, his weathered face creasing into a smile of surprise. Josiah, didn't expect to see you tonight. Figured the snow would keep you holed up in your cabin. Need supplies, Josiah said tersely. Coffee, flour, beans, and some food suitable for a child. Murphy raised an eyebrow. A child? You got company. Up there, in a manner of speaking, Josiah replied, not ready to explain the situation to anyone yet. Can you put together a bundle? I'll take whatever you have that's appropriate. Sure thing, Murphy said, moving to gather items from his shelves. Got some canned peaches, crackers, dried meat. There's a loaf of bread Sarah Morrison baked this morning, still fresh. As Murphy assembled the supplies, Doc Morrison emerged from the saloon's main room, his medical bag in hand. The doctor was a man in his 60s with kind eyes and gentle hands, someone Josiah had come to trust during their occasional interactions. Josiah, Doc Morrison said with surprise, unusual to see you in town so late. Unusual circumstances, Josiah replied. Everything all right? You look like you've had a shock. Before Josiah could answer, the back door opened and Nora stepped. Inside, driven by the cold and curiosity, the warmth of the room made her shiver more violently, highlighting just how chilled she had become. Doc Morrison's eyes widened as he took in the child's appearance. Her thin frame, ragged clothes, and the unmistakable signs of someone who had been living rough. "Well now," the doctor said softly, "who do we have here?" "This is Nora," Josiah said carefully. She's my granddaughter." Both Murphy and Doc Morrison stared at him in amazement. Everyone in town knew that Josiah's only child had died in the avalanche 15 years ago. "Your granddaughter?" Doc Morrison repeated, his physician's eye already assessing the child's condition. "Josiah, I think there's a story here that needs telling." "There is," Josiah agreed, "but not tonight. Tonight she needs warmth and food and a safe place to sleep." Doc Morrison nodded, understanding priorities. "She looks undernourished and cold, but nothing that can't be remedied with proper care. You'll want to warm her up gradually. Too much heat too fast can be dangerous." "I know," Josiah said, though he was grateful for the reminder. It had been so long since he'd cared for anyone other than himself. Murphy finished packing the supplies into a canvas bag, his expression thoughtful. "Josiah, if you need anything else, blankets, clothes, whatever, you just let me know. This little one looks like she's been through enough." "Thank you," Josiah said, meaning it. He had forgotten that people could be kind without expecting anything in return. "Mama always said people in small towns looked out for each other," Nora said softly, speaking for the first time since entering the building. "Your mama was right," Doc Morrison said gently, "and we'll look out for you too, child." Josiah shouldered the supply bag and took Nora's small hand in his larger, calloused one. The simple contact sent another wave of emotion through him. When was the last time he had held another person's hand? The gesture was both foreign and achingly familiar. "We need to get you up to the cabin before this storm gets worse," he said. "Will I like it there?" Nora asked as they prepared to venture back into the snow. "I don't know," Josiah answered honestly. "It's quiet, very quiet, and lonely." "I don't mind quiet," she said. "And it won't be lonely if we're together." The simple wisdom of her words hit him like a revelation. Loneliness wasn't about being alone. It was about being disconnected from the people who mattered. For 15 years, he had chosen isolation as a shield against further loss. But this child, this unexpected gift, was offering him something he had thought was lost forever, the possibility of family. As they stepped out into the swirling snow, Josiah felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders like a familiar coat. He had a granddaughter now, someone who depended on him, trusted him, needed him to be more than just a hermit hiding from his pain. The mountain path stretched ahead of them, leading up to the cabin that had been his refuge and his prison. Tonight, it would become something new, a home for two people learning to be a family. "Grandpa?" Nora said as they began the climb, her small hand still clasped in his. "Yes, I'm glad I found you. Despite everything, the shock, the fear, the overwhelming responsibility." Josiah found himself smiling for the first time in years. "I'm glad you did too, child. I'm glad you did too." The climb up to Josiah's cabin took longer than usual, partly because of the deepening snow, and partly because he found himself adjusting his pace for Nora's shorter legs. She didn't complain, even when the path grew steep and treacherous, but he could see her struggling to keep up. Twice he offered to carry her, but she politely declined, insisting she was strong enough to make it on her own. Her determination reminded him painfully of David at that age. Stubborn, proud, unwilling to admit weakness, even when it would have been sensible to ask for help. The resemblance went beyond mere attitude. In the moonlight filtering through the snow clouds, he could see echoes of his son in the shape of her face, the set of her jaw, the way she held her shoulders. By the time they reached the cabin, both of them were exhausted and thoroughly chilled. Josiah quickly built up the fire in the stone hearth, grateful for the stack of dry wood he had prepared earlier in the week. The flames caught quickly, casting dancing shadows on the walls and filling the space with welcome warmth. Nora stood near the door, taking in her surroundings with curious eyes. The cabin was larger than she had expected. A main room with the fireplace, kitchen area, and Josiah's reading corner, plus a small bedroom and storage area. Everything was neat and well-maintained, but sparse in a way that spoke of a man who owned only what he needed. "It's very clean," she said, her voice carrying a note of approval. "Mama always said you could tell a lot about a person by how they kept their home." "What does this tell you?" Josiah asked, genuinely curious about her assessment. "That you're careful, and maybe a little sad." She pointed to the bookshelves lined with volumes but empty of any personal mementos. "You've got lots of books but no pictures or pretty things. Mama said men who live alone sometimes forget that homes should have beauty, not just usefulness." Her observation was uncomfortably accurate. Josiah had deliberately purged his living space of anything that might trigger memories or emotions. The cabin was functional, nothing more. "You must be hungry," he said, deflecting the conversation away from his personal habits. "Let me get you something to eat." As he prepared a simple meal of bread, cheese, and the canned peaches Murphy had provided, Nora wandered around the cabin with the natural curiosity of a child. She paused at his reading corner, running her fingers along the spines of books on history and philosophy. "Can you read?" Josiah asked. "Yes, sir. Mama taught me. She said education was the one thing nobody could take away from you, no matter how poor you were." Nora pulled one of the books from the shelf, a collection of essays by Ralph Waldo Emerson. "This looks important." "It is, in its way, but perhaps too advanced for someone your age." "I'm a good reader," she said with quiet confidence. "Mama said I was reading at a level far beyond my years." She continued her exploration, eventually making her way to the far corner of the room where Josiah kept his workshop supplies. That's where she found it. The hand-carved wooden horse sitting on a shelf alongside his woodworking tools. The toy was beautifully crafted, carved from a single piece of pine with careful attention to detail. The horse's mane flowed naturally, its legs positioned in mid-gallop, its expression somehow conveying both strength and gentleness. It was clearly the work of someone with considerable skill and infinite patience. "Oh," Nora breathed, reaching toward the carving with reverent hands. "May I?" Josiah's throat constricted. He had carved that horse for David's 5th birthday, spending weeks getting every detail perfect. After the avalanche, he had packed it away with other memories too painful to face, but somehow it had ended up on his workshop shelf, a reminder of happier times that he could neither fully embrace nor completely abandon. "Go ahead," he managed. To say, Nora lifted the wooden horse carefully, cradling it in her small palms as if it were made of the finest china. Her eyes lit up with the kind of pure delight that only children can experience when encountering something truly wonderful. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "Someone made this with a lot of love." "I made it," Josiah said quietly, "for your father, when he was about your age." Nora's eyes widened with wonder and recognition. "Papa played with this every day for years. He took it everywhere, to bed, on trips to town, even tried to take it to school until his mother convinced him it would be safer at home." She held the horse closer, as if trying to absorb some connection to the father she had never known. "What was he like when he was little, I mean?" Josiah settled into his reading chair, surprised by how much he wanted to share these memories. For years he had buried thoughts of David's childhood, finding them too painful to revisit. But watching Nora hold the toy he had crafted with such hope and love, he discovered that the memories brought warmth along with the pain. "He was curious about everything," Josiah began, "always asking questions, always wanting to know how things worked or why they were the way they were. Your grandmother used to joke that he asked more questions in a day than most people asked. In a lifetime. Mama said I asked too many questions sometimes. There's no such thing as too many questions," Josiah said firmly. "Questions are how we learn about the world." As they ate their simple meal, Josiah found himself sharing stories he hadn't spoken aloud in years. David's first successful fishing trip, when he was so excited about catching a tiny trout that he insisted on showing it to everyone in town. The time he tried to build a tree house and ended up stuck on a branch, too scared to climb down, but too proud to call for help. His fascination with books, and his habit of reading by firelight until his mother had to confiscate his lamp. "He sounds wonderful," Nora said wistfully. "I wish I could have known him." "He would have loved you," Josiah said with certainty. "You have his curiosity, his determination, and his stubborn streak," he added with a gentle smile. "Is that why you stayed away all these years? Because it hurt too much to remember?" Her question was direct and perceptive, cutting straight to the heart of his self-imposed exile. He could have deflected, changed the subject, maintained the emotional barriers he had spent years constructing, but something about her earnest gaze and the way she held David's carved horse made deception impossible. "Yes," he said simply, "it hurt too much. So I convinced myself that being alone was easier than risking that kind of pain again." "But you weren't really alone," Nora said, with the clarity that children sometimes possess. "You were just hiding from the people who might have loved you." Her words hit him like a physical blow, not because they were harsh, but because they were true. Catherine had tried to find him after David's death. Nora had said as much. There might have been opportunities for connection, for family, if he had been brave enough to accept them. "I was afraid," he admitted, "afraid of being hurt. Again." Mama used to say that being afraid was normal, but staying afraid was a choice. The wisdom in her statement, delivered with such matter-of-fact simplicity, made him realize how much Catherine must have loved and nurtured this child. Despite her own struggles and hardships, she had raised a daughter who possessed both strength and compassion. "Your mother sounds like she was a remarkable woman." "She was," Nora said, though her voice carried the sadness of loss. She never stopped believing that people were basically good, even when they disappointed her. As the evening wore on and the storm intensified outside, Josiah prepared a bed for Nora near the fireplace, where she would be warm through the night. She insisted on helping, arranging the blankets with the same careful attention to detail she had shown with everything else. "Grandpa," she said as he banked the fire for the night. "Yes? Thank you for taking me in. I know this changes everything for you." He looked at her small face, so serious and grateful, and felt something fundamental shift inside his chest. She was right. This did change everything. His carefully ordered solitude, his protective isolation, his determination to avoid emotional risk. All of it would have to be reconsidered now. But perhaps, he thought, as he watched her settle into her makeshift bed with David's wooden horse clutched protectively against her chest, perhaps it was time for his world to change. Josiah woke before dawn, as was his habit, but lay still in his narrow bed listening to the unfamiliar sound of another person breathing in his cabin. For a moment, he wondered if the previous night had been an elaborate dream. The discovery of Nora, the revelation of David's survival and marriage, the overwhelming reality of suddenly having a granddaughter. But the soft rustling of blankets from the main room confirmed that it was all real. He had a child in his care now, someone who depended on him for food, shelter, and safety. The responsibility felt both terrifying and strangely right. He dressed quietly and moved to the kitchen area to prepare breakfast. Coffee first. That was non-negotiable. Then something suitable for a young girl who had been living on scraps. Oatmeal, perhaps, with some of the dried fruit he kept for winter meals. "Good morning," came a small voice from near the fireplace. He turned to find Nora sitting up in her nest of blankets, David's wooden horse still clutched in her hands. Her dark hair was tousled from sleep, and there was a crease on her cheek. From the pillow, but her eyes were alert and curious. "Good morning," he replied. "Did you sleep well?" "Yes, sir. It was the warmest I've been in months." She stretched like a contented cat, then carefully set the wooden horse aside and began folding her blankets. Mama always said guests should help with chores. You're not a guest, Josiah said, the words surprising him with their firmness. You're family. The simple statement seemed to affect them both. Nora's eyes brightened with something that might have been hope, while Josiah felt a flutter of panic at his own commitment. Family meant permanence, responsibility, emotional investment, all the things he had spent 15 years avoiding. What do families do in the morning? Nora asked, her question carrying more weight than its casual tone suggested. Josiah paused, realizing he had forgotten the rhythms of family life. They eat breakfast together, talk about the day ahead, take care of each other. That sounds nice, she said softly. As they shared their simple meal, Josiah found himself studying her face in the morning light. The resemblance to David was even more pronounced now. The shape of her eyes, the way she tilted her head when thinking, the habit of tucking a strand of hair behind her ear when concentrating. Tell me about your mother, he said. About Catherine. Nora's face lit up with love and memory. She was the kindest person you could imagine. Even when we didn't have much, she always found ways to help people who had less. She could make a feast out of nothing, and she had the most beautiful singing voice. She and your father, they were happy together. Mama said they were. She kept a box of letters he wrote to her before they got married. Sometimes she'd read, in parts of them to me. He wrote about wanting to build her a house with a garden, about hoping to make peace with his father someday. Nora's expression grew thoughtful. She said he talked about you a lot, especially near the end. Said he wished he could have made things right between you. The words hit Josiah like physical blows. David had survived, had loved and been loved, had wanted reconciliation. All of that had happened while Josiah nursed his grief in solitude, assuming his son was dead and buried. Near the end, he asked, though he dreaded the answer, there was an accident at the mine where he worked. A cave-in. Mama was already carrying me then, but Papa didn't live to see me born. She said his last words were about wanting to find you, to tell you he was sorry for the harsh words they'd exchanged before the avalanche. Josiah's hands trembled as he set down his coffee cup. David had been alive for years after the avalanche, had married Catherine, had worked to support his growing family, and his last thoughts had been of reconciliation with the father who had disappeared into the mountains. I need to show you something, he said, rising from the table with sudden purpose. He walked to the corner of the room where he kept a small wooden chest, one he hadn't opened in over a decade. Inside, wrapped in soft cloth, was Anna's wedding ring, a simple gold band that had been her most precious possession after the locket. This belonged to your grandmother, he said, returning to the table. Anna wore it every day of our marriage. Nora reached out reverently to touch the ring. It's beautiful, so simple, but elegant. Anna always said the best things in life were simple. Love, family, kindness. They didn't need ornament or decoration to be perfect. Josiah's voice grew thick with emotion. She would have adored you, Nora, would have spoiled you with attention and filled your head with stories. What kind of stories? Adventures, mostly. Anna had a wonderful imagination. She used to tell David tales about brave knights and clever princesses, about talking animals and magical forests. She believed children needed wonder in their lives. Mama told me stories too, but they were mostly about real people. About Papa when he was young, about you and Anna, about the life she hoped we might have someday. The weight of missed opportunities pressed down on Josiah like a physical force. While he had been hiding in his mountain sanctuary, Catherine had been keeping family memories alive for her daughter, nurturing connections that Josiah had severed with his retreat from the world. She tried to find me, didn't she? He asked. After David died, Nora nodded solemnly. She spent months looking. Asked everyone she met if they knew anything about a man named Josiah Hartwell who might be living in the mountains. Some people remembered you, but no one knew exactly where you'd gone. I made sure of that, Josiah said bitterly. I wanted to disappear completely. Why? The question was simple but profound. Why did you want to disappear? Josiah struggled to find words. That would make sense to a 9-year-old child. How could he explain the crushing weight of survivor's guilt, the way grief could transform love into something so painful that isolation seemed like the only solution? When someone you love dies, he said carefully, it feels like part of you dies too. I thought if I stayed away from people, if I didn't care about anyone else, I could protect myself from ever feeling that kind of pain again. But you still felt the pain anyway, Nora observed with startling insight. Being alone didn't make it go away, did it? No, he admitted. It just made it lonelier. She was quiet for a long moment, turning Anna's ring over in her small hands. Mama used to say that love wasn't something you could use up. The more you gave away, the more you had. She said that's why families were so important. They were how love grew and spread. Her words carried the wisdom of someone far older than her years, shaped by loss but not broken by it. Catherine had clearly done a remarkable job raising this child, instilling in her both strength and compassion. Your mother was a wise woman, Josiah said. I wish I had known her better. She always hoped you might come to visit someday. Even after Papa died, she used to set an extra place at the table on holidays, just in case you showed up. The image of Catherine setting a place for him, year after year, maintaining hope for a reconciliation that never came, brought fresh tears to his eyes. He had been so consumed with his own grief that he had never considered the possibility that others might be grieving too, might need the comfort that family could provide. I was a fool, he said quietly, a selfish, cowardly fool. Mama didn't think so. She said grief made people do strange things sometimes, but that didn't make them bad people. She said you were probably hurting too much to know how to reach out. She was kinder than I deserved. Maybe, Nora said with a small smile. But that's what family does. They love you even when you don't deserve it. As the morning progressed, Josiah found himself sharing more memories than he had spoken aloud in years. Stories about David's childhood, about Anna's gentle wisdom, about the dreams they had shared for their family's future. Nora listened with rapt attention, absorbing every detail as if they were precious treasures. In return, she told him about her life with Catherine, the small apartment where they had lived, the neighbors who had become like extended family, the way Catherine had worked tirelessly to provide for her daughter while never complaining about her circumstances. She saved every penny she could, Nora explained. Said she was putting aside money for my education so I could have opportunities she never had. After she died, the landlord said there wasn't any money, but I know there was. I saw her count it out and put it in the tin box under her bed. Something in her tone caught Josiah's attention. What happened to that money? The landlord said there were debts that had to be paid, expenses that ate up everything Mama had saved, but I don't think that was true. I think he just kept it for himself. A spark of anger flared in Josiah's chest, not the cold, numbing grief he had carried for so long, but something hotter and more focused. Someone had taken advantage of a grieving child, stolen money that Catherine had sacrificed to save. Do you remember his name? He asked. This landlord? Mr. Webb, Cornelius Webb. He owned several buildings in Leadville, always dressed fancy and talked about how successful his business was. Josiah filed the name away for future consideration. If Catherine had indeed left money for Nora's future, and if this Webb had stolen it, then perhaps something could be done about it. The child deserved whatever inheritance her mother had struggled to provide. For now, he said, you don't need to worry about money or landlords or taking care of yourself. You're home now, is that what this is? Nora asked, looking around the cabin with new eyes. Home, if you want it to be, Josiah replied, surprising himself with how much he hoped she would say yes. I'd like that very much, she said softly. I'd like to have a home again. As she spoke, she reached for his hand across the table, her small fingers intertwining with his weathered ones. The simple contact sent warmth spreading through his chest, not the sharp pain of memory, but something gentler and more hopeful. For the first time in 15 years, Josiah Hartwell was no longer alone. 3 days after Christmas, Josiah made a decision that would have been unthinkable a week earlier. He invited Doc Morrison up to the cabin. The doctor had been concerned about Nora's health, and Josiah wanted a professional assessment of her condition after months of inadequate nutrition and shelter. But there was another reason for the invitation, one he hadn't fully admitted to himself. He needed to talk to someone about the overwhelming changes in his life, and Doc Morrison was one of the few people in Cedar Ridge whom he trusted completely. The doctor arrived in the early afternoon, his medical bag slung over his shoulder and his face flushed from the climb up the mountain path. He paused at the cabin's threshold, clearly surprised by what he saw inside. The space had been transformed. Nora's presence had brought life to rooms that had been merely functional for 15 years. Her few possessions were neatly arranged. Near the fireplace, David's wooden horse sat on the mantel like an honored guest. Most noticeably, there were signs of shared meals, of conversation, of two people learning to live together. "Well," Doc Morrison said, settling his bulk into Josiah's reading chair, "this is quite a change from your usual hermitage." "Everything's changed," Josiah admitted, watching as Nora shyly approached the doctor. She had been nervous about meeting him, worried that he might disapprove of her staying with Josiah. "Hello, young lady," Doc Morrison said gently. "I'm Dr. Morrison, but most folks just call me Doc. Your grandfather tells me you've been through quite an adventure." "Yes, sir," Nora replied politely. "But I'm fine now. Grandpa's been taking good care of me." The examination was thorough, but gentle. Doc Morrison checked her weight, listened to her heart and lungs, examined her hands and feet for signs of frostbite or other cold weather injuries. Throughout the process, he kept up a steady stream of conversation that put Nora at ease. "She's undernourished but fundamentally healthy," he told Josiah afterward, while Nora was outside gathering firewood. "A few weeks of regular meals should put some meat on her bones. No signs of serious illness or injury, though her hands show calluses unusual for a child her age." "She's had to work for her survival," Josiah said grimly. "No child should have to live that way." "No, they shouldn't. But she's resilient. You can see it in the way she carries herself. Someone raised her well before circumstances turned against her. Catherine, her mother." "Tell me about that," Doc Morrison said, accepting a cup of coffee and settling in for what was clearly going to be a long conversation, the whole story from the beginning. So Josiah told him everything, about finding Nora behind the saloon, about learning of David's survival and marriage, about the years of missed opportunities and the weight of regrets. The doctor listened without interruption, his expression growing more thoughtful with each revelation. "David survived the avalanche," Doc Morrison said when Josiah finished. "I remember that day, the search parties, the rescue attempts. We never found any survivors. He must have been thrown clear, maybe injured, but not killed, made his way to safety somehow. And never contacted you?" "I had already left town by then, sold the house, disappeared into the mountains. If he did try to find me, I made sure it would be impossible." Doc Morrison was quiet for a long moment, processing. "The implications. Josiah, you realize what this means. David was alive for years after we all assumed he was dead. He married Catherine Mills, had a child, tried to build a life. And you—" "I abandoned him," Josiah said flatly, "when he needed his father most. I was wallowing in self-pity and grief. You didn't know. I didn't try to know. I was so consumed with my own pain that I never considered the possibility that others might have survived, might have needed me." Nora returned with an armload of firewood, her cheeks pink from the cold air. She arranged the logs carefully by the fireplace, then joined the two men at the table. "Doc Morrison," she said seriously, "I found something I think you should see." She disappeared into the corner where Josiah kept his personal belongings and returned with a small, leather-bound journal. Josiah recognized it immediately. David's journal, one of the few items he had managed to save from his son's room before. Leaving town. I found this while I was looking around yesterday, Nora said, placing the journal on the table. Grandpa said it belonged to my papa. I can read most of it, but some of the words are difficult. Josiah's hands trembled as he opened the journal. He had never been able to bring himself to read it before. The pain of seeing David's handwriting, his thoughts and dreams preserved on paper, had been too overwhelming. But with Nora sitting beside him, her presence somehow making the past feel less dangerous, he found the courage to look. The entries began shortly before the avalanche, when David was 18 and full of plans for his future. His handwriting was neat and careful, his thoughts expressed with the earnest sincerity of a young man in love. December 10th, Josiah read aloud. Spoke with Catherine's father today about my intentions. He gave his blessing, though he wants us to wait until spring to marry. Catherine says she doesn't mind waiting. She wants time to prepare properly. I think she's more excited about planning the wedding than actually being married, which makes me love her even more. He flipped ahead, past entries about work and daily life, looking for references to their relationship. February 3rd, had another argument with Pa today about my plans. He thinks I'm too young to marry, says I should see more of the world before settling down. Maybe he's right, but I can't imagine loving anyone the way I love Catherine. He married Ma when he was 19. Why? Is it different for me? The words cut deep. Josiah remembered that argument, remembered being frustrated with David's stubbornness, his refusal to consider waiting. At the time, it had seemed like reasonable parental guidance. Now it felt like precious time wasted on pointless conflict. February 14th, gave Catherine the locket that belonged to Ma. She cried when she saw it, said it was the most beautiful thing anyone had ever given her. I told her Ma would have wanted her to have it, that she would have loved Catherine like a daughter. I hope that's true. I hope someday Pa will see what I see in her. Nora reached over and touched the locket at her throat. He gave this to Mama? It appears so, Josiah said, his voice thick with emotion. It was your grandmother Anna's wedding gift from me. They continued reading, discovering entries that revealed David's deep love for Catherine, his excitement about their future together, and his ongoing hope for reconciliation with his father. March 12th. The snow is finally melting. Catherine and I walked up to the overlook today to watch the valley wake up from winter. She says she wants to build our house somewhere with a view like that, where we can watch the seasons change and our children can play in sight of the mountains. I think Pa would like her vision. She understands the beauty of this place the way he and Ma always did. March 20th. Had coffee with Doc Morrison today. He asked about Pa, whether I'd heard from him since he left town. I told him no, but that I keep hoping he'll come back someday. Doc says grief affects people differently, that some folks need to withdraw before they can heal. I hope he's right. I hope Pa is healing somewhere up in those mountains. The entries painted a picture of a young man who loved deeply, dreamed boldly, and never stopped hoping for his father's return. Even in the final entry, dated just days before the avalanche, David had written about his plans to search for Josiah after he and Catherine were married. We'll find him, David had written. Catherine believes families should stick together no matter what. She says love is stronger than grief, and that Pa just needs to be reminded that he's still got people who care about him. When Josiah finished reading, the cabin was silent except for the crackling of the fire. Nora was crying quietly, tears streaming down her cheeks as she mourned the father she had never known. Doc Morrison sat with his head bowed, clearly moved by the glimpse into David's heart and mind. He never stopped loving you, the doctor said finally. Even when you disappeared, even when he must have felt abandoned, he never stopped hoping for reconciliation. And I never gave him the chance, Josiah whispered. I was so buried in my own grief that I couldn't see past it to the people who might have needed me. But you can see now, Nora said softly, and Papa would be happy that we found each other. Mama always said he believed everything happened for a reason, even the sad things. As the afternoon wore on, Doc Morrison helped Josiah begin to process the complex emotions that David's journal had stirred up. There was grief, certainly, for all the lost opportunities and unspoken words. But there was also something else, a sense that David's love had somehow reached across the years to bring his daughter to the grandfather she needed. "She's a remarkable child," Doc Morrison said as he prepared to leave. "David and Catherine raised her well, even in difficult circumstances." "I don't know if I can be the grandfather she deserves," Josiah admitted. "I've forgotten how to be part of a family." "Then you'll have to remember," the doctor said simply. "Or better yet, let her teach you. Children have a way of showing us what really matters." A week into the new year, Nora surprised Josiah by producing something he hadn't known she possessed. A letter carefully folded and worn soft from handling. She had been carrying it in the inner pocket of her ragged dress, protecting it like the precious thing it was. "Mama wrote this before she died," Nora said, settling beside him at the kitchen table. "She made me promise to give it to you if I ever found you." Josiah's hands shook as he unfolded the paper. Catherine's handwriting was neat and feminine, though he could see places where her illness had made her pen waver. "My dear Father Hartwell," it began, and Josiah had to stop reading for a moment to compose himself. Catherine had claimed him. As family, had chosen to see him as the father-in-law she had never met, rather than the stranger who had abandoned his responsibilities. He began again. "My dear Father Hartwell, if you are reading this letter, it means our sweet Nora has found her way to you at last. I pray that you will welcome her with the kindness that David always assured me lived in your heart, despite the grief that drove you away from us. I want you to know that I never blamed you for your absence after the avalanche." David explained to me how deeply you loved Anna, how her loss nearly destroyed you. "When we learned that you had disappeared into the mountains, I understood that some wounds cut so deep that solitude seems like the only medicine. But I also want you to know that David never stopped hoping for your return, never stopped believing that someday you would find your way back to family. Our marriage was brief but beautiful. David was everything I could have hoped for in a husband, kind, hard-working, devoted to our future together. He spoke of you often, sharing stories of his childhood and the lessons you taught him about integrity and perseverance. Those stories became the foundation of how I hope to raise our daughter, passing along the Hartwell values, even though she would never know her father directly. When the mine accident took David from us, I was heartbroken, but not hopeless. I had our baby to think about, and I was determined to honor David's memory by being the best mother I could be. Nora has been the light of my life, intelligent, compassionate, resilient in ways that constantly amaze me. She has David's curiosity and determination, but also a sweetness that I like to think comes from the love that surrounded her creation. I tried to find you after David died. I asked everyone I could think of, followed every rumor and suggestion, spent months searching for any trace of where you might have gone. Part of me wanted to share my grief with the only other person who had loved David as much as I did. But, more than that, I wanted Nora to know her grandfather, to understand that she had family beyond just me. I've done my best to prepare her for the possibility of finding you someday. She knows the stories of your life with Anna and David. She knows about your skills as a carpenter and your love of books. She knows that you withdrew from the world because your heart was broken, not because you stopped caring about family. If my illness claims me before she reaches adulthood, I trust that you will see past your grief to the remarkable young woman she is becoming. There is something else you should know. When David died, he left behind a small inheritance, money he had saved from his mining work, and some jewelry that belonged to his grandmother. I've been careful with these resources, using them sparingly to support Nora and me while putting aside what I could for her future education. The money is hidden in a safe place, along with documents that prove Nora's identity and inheritance rights. I'm entrusting these details to Mr. Cornelius Webb, who manages several properties in Leadville, and has agreed to serve as executor of David's estate. He has assured me that everything will be properly maintained until Nora comes of age. The specific arrangements are documented in papers that Mr. Webb keeps in his office safe. Please don't blame yourself for the years we spent apart. Grief has its own timeline, and healing cannot be forced or rushed. What matters now is that Nora has found her way to you, and that you have the opportunity to be part of her life going forward. She needs family, Josiah. She needs someone who remembers David and Anna, someone who can help her understand where she comes from and who she might become. I know that taking responsibility for a child will mean enormous changes in your life. I know that solitude has been your protection and your comfort for many years. But I also believe that love is stronger than fear, and that Nora's presence in your life might help heal wounds that time alone could not touch. Please be patient with her and with yourself. She's never had a grandfather before, and you haven't been responsible for a child in many years. There will be challenges and adjustments, moments of frustration and uncertainty, but there will also be joy, laughter, and the deep satisfaction that comes from watching someone you love grow and flourish. David would be so proud to know that his father and daughter have found each other. He always believed that family was the most important thing in life, that love was the force that could overcome any obstacle. I hope that belief proves true for both of you. With all my love and gratitude, Catherine Hartwell P.S. Nora has her father's wooden horse and Anna's locket, but there are other family treasures waiting for her in Leadville. Mr. Webb has the details and the legal documents. Please don't let bureaucracy or pride prevent her from claiming what David meant for her to have. When Josiah finished reading, tears were streaming down his face. Catherine's words painted a picture of a woman who had faced tremendous hardship, with grace and courage, who had never allowed bitterness to poison her love for the family that had claimed her. She was remarkable, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. She always said good people deserved good things, even when life didn't work out that way, Nora replied. She never complained about being alone or having to work so hard. She just did what needed to be done. And she raised you to be just like her. I try to be. Sometimes it's hard, though. Sometimes I get angry about the way things happened, about Papa dying and Mama getting sick and having to live on the streets. That's natural, Josiah said, reaching over to squeeze her hand. Even good people get angry sometimes. The trick is not letting the anger make you bitter. He folded the letter carefully, understanding now why Catherine had been so specific about the arrangements with Mr. Webb. She had been protecting Nora's inheritance, ensuring that her daughter would have resources for education and a better life. This, Mr. Webb, Josiah said. You mentioned him before. Tell me about your interactions with him. Nora's expression darkened slightly. He was always very polite when Mama was alive, always dressed fancy and talked about how important his business was. But after Mama died, he seemed different, less patient, more eager to get me out of the apartment. What exactly did he say about your mother's savings? That there were debts and expenses that ate up everything Mama had put aside. He said the funeral costs and back rent and medical bills added up to more than she had saved. But that doesn't make sense, because I know Mama was careful about money. She showed me the tin box where she kept our savings, and there was a good amount in there. A cold anger began building in Josiah's chest. He had seen enough of the world to recognize the signs of someone taking advantage of a grieving child. If Webb had indeed stolen Catherine's savings, claiming expenses that didn't exist, did he give you any papers, any documentation of these supposed debts and expenses? He said everything was too complicated for a child to understand, that I should just trust that he had handled everything properly. That settled it. Tomorrow, Josiah would make the journey to Leadville to investigate Mr. Cornelius Webb and the fate of Catherine's carefully saved inheritance. Nora deserved better than to be cheated out of her birthright by someone who preyed on the vulnerable. We're going to look into this, he promised her. If your mother left money for your future, We'll make sure you get what's rightfully yours." "You don't have to do that," Nora said quietly. "I don't want to cause trouble." "You're not causing trouble, you're family, and family looks out for each other." The word still felt strange on his tongue, but it was growing more comfortable each time he used it. Family. He had a granddaughter now, someone who depended on him not just for shelter and food, but for justice and protection. "Besides," he added with a wry smile, "it's been 15 years since anyone gave me a good reason to be righteously angry. I think I'm going to enjoy setting Mr. Webb straight about proper treatment of widows and orphans, for the first time since." He had known her. Nora giggled, a sound of pure delight that filled the cabin with warmth and possibility. It was the sound of a child learning to trust that she was finally, truly safe. And for Josiah, it was the sound of his heart remembering how to hope. The journey to Leadville took 2 days through mountain passes still treacherous with winter snow. Josiah had arranged for Nora to stay with Doc Morrison and his wife during his absence, though leaving her behind had been harder than he expected. She had become such a constant presence in his life that the cabin felt hollow without her cheerful chatter and busy movements. Leadville was a bustling mining town, much larger and more prosperous than Cedar Ridge. The streets were crowded with workers, merchants, and the kind of opportunists who flocked to places where money flowed freely. It was exactly the type of place where someone like Cornelius Webb could build a profitable business, exploiting those who lacked protection or resources. Webb's office was located in a substantial brick building on the main street, with gold lettering on the window advertising property management and estate services. The man himself proved to be exactly what Josiah had expected. Well-dressed, smooth-talking, with the kind of practiced charm that made people trust him with their most valuable possessions. "Mr. Hartwell," Webb said, rising from behind an impressive mahogany desk. "What an unexpected pleasure. I heard rumors that you had taken in young Nora. Such a tragic case, that poor child losing her mother so young." "Indeed," Josiah replied, settling into the offered chair and studying Webb carefully. "Which is why I'm here. Nora mentioned that her mother left some money for her future, and I wanted to understand the current status of those funds." Webb's smile never wavered, but something shifted behind his eyes. "Ah yes, Catherine's estate. Such a sad situation. I'm afraid there wasn't much left after all the expenses were settled. Medical bills, funeral costs, back rent. It all adds up quickly when someone is ill for an extended period." "I'd like to see the documentation," Josiah said calmly. "The receipts, invoices, whatever records you have of these expenses." Of course," Webb said, though he made no move toward the filing cabinets that lined one wall. "Though I should warn you, the paperwork is quite extensive and rather technical. Most laymen find it difficult to follow. I'll manage." Webb hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the request. "Perhaps it would be better if I simply explained the situation. Catherine Mills, that is Catherine Hartwell, owed significant back rent on her apartment. There were also outstanding medical bills from her final illness, costs associated with her burial, and various other debts that had accumulated over time. When we tallied everything up, the expenses exceeded her savings by a considerable margin." "So you're saying she died in debt?" "Unfortunately, yes. In fact, if not for my generosity in absorbing the excess costs, the estate would have left creditors unpaid." Josiah leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "That's curious. From what Nora tells me, her mother was very careful about money. Saved every penny she could, lived simply, avoided unnecessary expenses. Doesn't sound like someone who would accumulate significant debts." "People aren't always honest about their financial situations," Webb said with a dismissive wave. "Catherine may have hidden the extent of her difficulties from her daughter to spare the child's feelings. Perhaps. But you see, I have here a letter that Catherine wrote before her death, describing her financial arrangements in some detail." Josiah pulled the letter from his coat pocket. "She specifically mentions money she had saved for Nora's education, and she refers to you as the executor of David's estate. She seemed quite confident that everything was properly documented and secured. The color drained from Webb's face, though he tried to maintain his composure. Letters written by dying people aren't always reliable. Illness can affect judgment, memory. She also mentions specific arrangements, documents kept in your office. Safe, details about David's inheritance from his grandmother. Josiah's voice remained calm, but there was steel beneath the surface. I'd like to review those documents as well. I'm afraid that's impossible. Those records are confidential, not from family members. Nora is David's legal heir, and as her guardian, I have the right to examine any documents related to her inheritance. Webb stood abruptly, moving to the window as if suddenly interested in the street activity below. Mr. Hartwell, I think there may be some misunderstanding about the legal situation. Nora is an orphan without official guardianship papers. You have no legal standing to make demands about estate matters. Then perhaps we should discuss the matter with the local authorities. I'm sure the sheriff would be interested in reviewing your handling of estates involving orphan children. That won't be necessary, Webb said quickly. I'm sure we can work something out between gentlemen. Josiah stood as well, his patience exhausted. Mr. Webb, I've been patient with your evasions and excuses, but let me be very clear. That child is my granddaughter, and I will not allow anyone to cheat her out of what rightfully belongs to her. Either you produce the documentation I've requested, or I'll return with legal representation and a court order. For a moment, Webb's mask slipped completely, revealing something ugly beneath the polished exterior. You can't prove anything, he said. Catherine Mills is dead, and whatever she may have told you about money or documents, there's no evidence to support her claims. Isn't there? Josiah reached into his other pocket and produced a small, leather-bound ledger book. This belonged to Catherine. She kept meticulous records of her income and expenses, including regular deposits to her savings account at First National Bank. According to her records, she had nearly $300 put aside for Nora's future. Webb's eyes widened as he recognized the ledger. Where did you get that? Nora had it. Her mother gave it to her before she died, told her to keep it safe because it contained important information. Apparently, Catherine suspected that someone might try to take advantage of her daughter after she was gone. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken accusations and growing tension. Webb seemed to be calculating his options, trying to determine how much damage the ledger might do to his carefully constructed lies. Even if Catherine did save some money, he said finally, there were legitimate expenses that had to be paid. I have receipts. Forged receipts, I'm guessing, made out to businesses that either don't exist or have no record of providing services to Catherine Mills. Josiah's voice hardened. You see, Mr. Webb, I've spent the last day and a half checking with the doctor who treated Catherine, the funeral director who handled her burial, and the bank where she kept her account. Interesting conversations, all of them. Webb sank back into his chair, the fight going out of him like air from a punctured balloon. What do you want? I want Nora's inheritance returned to her immediately. All of it, with interest for the months. You've been using it for your own purposes, and I want a full accounting of any other estates you may have managed in similar fashion. You don't understand, Webb said desperately. I have obligations, business expenses, people depending on me. You have been stealing from orphans and widows, Josiah said coldly, using your position of trust to prey on people who had no one to protect them. That stops now. And if I refuse, then tomorrow morning I'll be visiting Sheriff Harrison with Catherine's ledger, copies of the bank records I've obtained, and testimony from several people who can verify the true costs of Catherine's medical care and burial. I imagine he'll be very interested in your business practices. Webb was quiet for a long time, staring at his hands while the implications of exposure settled around him. Finally, he looked up with the defeated expression of a man who had run out of options. The money is in my personal safe, he admitted. Most of it, anyway. I've had some cash flow problems with other investments. How much is left? about $240, plus some jewelry and documents that belonged to David's family. Get it, all of it, now, as Webb moved. Reluctantly toward a large safe hidden behind a painting on the far wall, Josiah felt a grim satisfaction settling over him. Justice was about to be served, not just for Nora, but for however many other victims Webb had exploited over the years. But more than that, he realized he had found something he had forgotten he possessed, the righteous anger that came from protecting family. For 15 years, he had felt only the cold, numbing grief of loss. Now, watching Webb count out bills with shaking hands, he felt the warm fire of purpose. Nora would get her inheritance, and Cornelius Webb would learn that some grandfathers were not as helpless as they appeared. "There's one more thing," Josiah said, as Webb handed over the money and documents. "I want you to prepare a complete list of every estate you've handled in the past 5 years, along with documentation of all expenses and distributions. If there are other victims of your generosity, they deserve to know the truth." Webb's face crumpled completely. "That will ruin me." "Yes," Josiah said without a trace of sympathy. "I believe it will." Josiah returned to Cedar Ridge with more than just Nora's recovered inheritance. He carried with him a growing understanding of how extensive Webb's fraud had been. The list of estates the man had managed read like a catalogue of the territory's most vulnerable citizens. Widows, orphans, elderly settlers without family, immigrants who didn't understand the legal system well enough to protect themselves. Doc Morrison listened grimly as Josiah recounted his confrontation with Webb, while Nora sat quietly nearby, overwhelmed by the reality of having her mother's savings restored. $240, she said wonderingly, touching the small stack of bills as if they might disappear. "Mama saved all this for me." "She did indeed," Josiah confirmed, "along with some jewelry that belonged to your grandmother and great-grandmother, and documents proving your father's military service and his share of the family mining claim." "Military service?" Doc Morrison looked surprised. "I didn't know David had enlisted." Apparently he joined up after the mining accident that took his life. According to the papers Webb was holding, David served with distinction in the Colorado Volunteer Regiment before he died. There's even a commendation for bravery. Nora's eyes filled with tears as she examined the military documents. Her father hadn't just been a miner who died in an accident. He had been a soldier who died serving his territory. The knowledge seemed to give her a different sense of who she was, where she came from. "But there's more to this situation," Josiah continued, his expression growing serious. "Webb's records show that he's been systematically defrauding people for years. Dozens of families have been cheated out of money that should have gone to support widows and children. What are you planning to do about it?" Doc Morrison asked, though his tone suggested he already suspected the answer. "I'm planning to see that justice is done. Not just for Nora, but for everyone Webb has victimized." "That's a noble sentiment, Josiah, but it could be dangerous. Men like Webb don't give up their schemes without a fight, especially when there's serious money involved. Which is why I need help," Josiah admitted. "I can't do this alone, and I can't do it quietly. The whole community needs to know what's been happening." Over the next few days, Josiah found himself engaged in activities he hadn't attempted in 15 years, talking to people, building alliances, organizing collective action. It was exhausting and terrifying, but also strangely exhilarating. For too long, he had focused only on his own pain and isolation. Now he had a cause that was bigger than his personal grief. Sheriff Callahan proved to be a valuable ally once he understood the scope of Webb's crimes. "I've had my suspicions about some of these estate settlements," he admitted, "but without specific complaints or evidence, there wasn't much I could do. People trusted Webb, and the victims were usually too powerless or uninformed to challenge his authority." "Well, now we have evidence," Josiah said, spreading Webb's records across the sheriff's desk. "And we have a community of people who deserve to know the truth. This is going to cause quite a stir." Sheriff Callahan warned. Webb has friends in high places, business connections, who won't be pleased to see their associate exposed as a fraud. Then they should have chosen their associates more carefully. But as word of the investigation began to spread, Josiah discovered that the sheriff's warnings had been well-founded. Webb had indeed cultivated powerful allies, and they were not prepared to abandon him without a fight. Judge Pemberton, who had overseen many of the estate settlements, paid an unexpected visit to the cabin one evening. He was a portly man in his 60s, with the kind of self-important manner that came from years of unquestioned authority. "Hartwell," he said without preamble, "I understand you've been making some serious accusations against Cornelius Webb." "I've been presenting evidence of criminal fraud," Josiah replied calmly. "If you want to call that an accusation, so be it. Webb is a respected businessman who has provided valuable services to this community for many years. These attacks on his reputation are both unfounded and destructive." "Are they? Because I have documents here that tell a very different story." Pemberton waved dismissively. "Paperwork can be misleading, especially to someone without legal training. Estate management is a complex business, and there are often legitimate expenses that laymen don't understand." Nora, who had been listening from her corner by the fireplace, spoke up suddenly. "Judge Pemberton, did you know my mama?" The judge looked at her with mild surprise. "I may have met her once or twice. Catherine Mills, wasn't it?" "Catherine Hartwell," Nora corrected firmly. "She was married to my papa, David Hartwell. And she wasn't a liar." "I never said she was, child. But you're saying she was wrong about the money she saved, wrong about the arrangements she made, wrong about what Mr. Webb promised her." Nora's voice was steady, but carried an edge of steel that reminded Josiah powerfully of Anna. "My mama was very smart about money. She had to be, because we didn't have very much of it. She wouldn't have been confused about something so important." Pemberton looked uncomfortable. "Estate matters can be complicated." "Not that complicated," Josiah interjected. "A woman saves money for her daughter's future, puts it in a bank account, keeps careful records of every deposit and withdrawal. When she dies, that money should go to her daughter. It's not complicated at all. There were debts, forged debts. I've checked with every business Webb claimed had provided services to Catherine. Half of them don't exist, and the other half have no record of ever dealing with her." The judge's face reddened. "That's a serious accusation, Hartwell. I hope you have solid proof to back it up." "I do. The question is whether you're interested in seeing justice done, or whether you're more concerned with protecting your friend's reputation." After Pemberton left, clearly frustrated by his inability to intimidate Josiah into dropping the matter, Nora moved closer to the fire, where her grandfather sat brooding. "He's scared," she observed. "Judge Pemberton is scared that people will find out he knew about Mr. Webb's stealing." "You're probably right," Josiah agreed, "which means we need to be very careful about how we proceed. Powerful men who are frightened can be dangerous." "Are you scared, Grandpa?" The question caught him off guard. Was he scared? Certainly there were risks involved in challenging Webb and his allies. But the emotion he felt most strongly wasn't fear, it was determination. "A little," he admitted honestly, "but I'm more angry than scared, and I'm not going to let that anger make me reckless." "What's our next step?" "Our next step," she had said. "Our," including herself in the struggle for justice. The realization both warmed and worried him. This fight was about her inheritance, her future, but she was still just a child. He didn't want her exposed to the uglier aspects of what was likely to come. "The next step is a public hearing," he said. "Sheriff Callahan is arranging for a formal presentation of the evidence, where everyone in the community can see what Webb has been doing and decide for themselves what should be done about it. Will people believe us? Some will. Others won't want to believe us because it means admitting they were fooled or that they ignored signs they should have seen. But the truth has a way of making itself heard, especially when it's backed up. by solid evidence. Over the following week, preparations for the hearing consumed most of Josiah's time and energy. He found himself working closely with people he hadn't spoken to in years, re-establishing connections that had been severed by his long withdrawal from community life. Murphy provided meeting space in his saloon for planning sessions. Several families who suspected they had been cheated by Webb came forward with their own stories and evidence. Even some of Webb's former allies began to distance themselves as the scope of his crimes became clear. But the opposition was organizing as well. Judge Pemberton and several prominent businessmen were pressuring people to stay away from the hearing, suggesting that it was nothing more than a vindictive attack by a bitter hermit who couldn't accept legitimate business practices. "They're trying to make this about you," Sheriff Callahan warned during one of their planning meetings, "about your mental state, your fitness as a guardian for Nora, your ability to understand complex financial matters." "Let them try," Josiah replied. "The evidence speaks for itself." Evidence isn't always enough, especially when the people judging it have reasons to ignore what it says. 2 days before the scheduled hearing, those concerns proved prophetic. Judge Pemberton arrived at the cabin with an official-looking document and a smug expression. "Hartwell," he announced, "I have here a petition filed by concerned citizens regarding the welfare of the minor child in your care. There are serious questions about your fitness as a guardian, given your history of mental instability and social isolation." Josiah felt the bottom drop out of his world. "What are you talking about?" The petitioners argue that a man who has lived as a hermit for 15 years, who has no experience raising children, who suffers from unresolved grief and possible mental illness, cannot provide proper care for an orphaned girl. They're requesting that Nora be placed in more suitable care until a proper evaluation can be conducted. "You can't do this," Josiah said, his voice rising with panic and rage. "She's my granddaughter. She belongs with family. That remains to be determined," Pemberton replied coldly. "The hearing on this matter has been scheduled for tomorrow morning. Until then, the child will be placed in temporary care with the Sisters of Mercy." "No," Nora cried, rushing to Josiah's side. "I won't go. This is my home now." "I'm sorry, child, but the law is the law. Pack whatever belongings you have. The sisters are waiting outside." As Josiah watched his granddaughter being led away, tears streaming down her face as she begged not to be separated from him, he understood that this was more than just an attack on Webb's crimes. This was a battle for Nora's future, for his right to be her family, for everything that had given his life meaning since that Christmas Eve when he found her behind Murphy's saloon. The real fight was just beginning. The hearing convened in Murphy's saloon at 10 o'clock on a grey February morning, with what seemed like half the territory in attendance. Word had spread far beyond Cedar Ridge, drawing people from neighboring towns who had their own suspicions about Webb's business practices. The atmosphere was tense and expectant, like the moment before a thunderstorm breaks. Judge Pemberton presided from behind a makeshift bench constructed from Murphy's best table, his expression stern and official. Webb sat at his right hand, looking pale but defiant, while Josiah found himself relegated to the far side of the room with Sheriff Callahan and Doc Morrison. "We are here today," Pemberton announced, "to address serious allegations of financial impropriety and to determine the proper guardianship of the minor child, Nora Hartwell. Let it be noted that Mr. Cornelius Webb has requested this opportunity to clear his name of the charges that have been leveled against him." Josiah felt a chill run down his spine. This was not the hearing he had expected. It was a trial with Webb positioned as the wronged party and himself cast as an unstable accuser whose fitness as a guardian was in question. Webb stood first, his voice carrying the smooth confidence of a man accustomed to swaying audiences. "Your Honor, I want to thank you for this opportunity to address the malicious rumors that have been circulating about my business practices. For over 10 years, I have served this community faithfully, managing the complex financial affairs of deceased residents and ensuring that their wishes are carried out according to law." He gestured toward Josiah with theatrical sorrow. "It pains me to see a man so consumed by grief and isolation that he would attack the very people who tried to help his family. When young Nora's mother died, I went out of my way to settle her affairs properly, even absorbing costs that exceeded her meager savings. And how am I repaid for this kindness? With accusations and threats from a man who abandoned his responsibilities 15 years ago and now seeks to blame others for his own failures." A murmur ran through the crowd, and Josiah could see some faces turning toward him with suspicion and doubt. Webb was playing his part expertly, positioning himself as the victim of an unbalanced hermit's vendetta. "Furthermore," Webb continued, "I must express my deep concern about the welfare of the child in question. Nora deserves a stable, nurturing environment, not the isolated cabin of a man who has spent years avoiding human contact. The evidence of Mr. Hartwell's mental instability is clear. His withdrawal from society, his inability to maintain normal relationships, his sudden obsession with conspiracy theories about respected businessmen." Judge Pemberton nodded gravely. "These are serious concerns, Mr. Webb. The court appreciates your civic-minded approach to this difficult situation." Josiah rose to his feet, anger boiling in his chest. "May I respond to these accusations?" "In due time, Mr. Hartwell. First, we'll hear from some character witnesses who can speak to your fitness as a guardian." The first witness called was Dr. Morrison, who walked to the front of the room with quiet dignity. His testimony was careful and measured, describing Nora's improved health and happiness since coming to live with Josiah, her obvious affection for her grandfather, and the positive changes he had observed in both of them. "In my medical opinion," Doc Morrison concluded, "Nora is thriving in Mr. Hartwell's care. She's gaining weight, her color is good, and she displays none of the behavioral problems we might expect from a traumatized child. If anything, she seems more confident and secure than when she first arrived." But Webb's allies had come prepared, with their own witnesses. 3 women from the Sisters of Mercy testified about the dangers of allowing children to live in isolated mountain cabins, far from proper schooling and social contact. A banker from Leadville spoke about the complex nature of estate management and the unfairness of attacking someone like Webb, who provided essential services to the community. Through it all, Josiah sat quietly, watching the careful orchestration of his character assassination. He could see Nora in the front row, her small face pale with worry, as she listened to adults debate her future as if she were a piece of property to be distributed. Then, something unexpected happened. Murphy himself stood up in the back of the room, his weathered face flushed with indignation. "Your Honor," he called out, "I've been listening to this nonsense for an hour, and I got something to say." "Mr. Murphy, this is not the appropriate." "A time like hell it isn't." Murphy pushed through the crowd toward the front. "You want to talk about character? About who's fit to care for a child? Well, let me tell you what I've seen." He turned to face the assembled crowd, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had served the community for decades. "I've known Josiah Hartwell for 20 years. Before his tragedy, he was the most honest, hard-working man in this territory. Yes, he withdrew after losing his family. Who among us wouldn't? But that child has brought him back to life in a way that's beautiful to see." Murphy pointed directly at Webb. "And as for you, Cornelius Webb, I've seen the way you operate. Smooth talk and fancy clothes, preying on people who don't know any better. You want to talk about character? Let's talk about the character it takes to steal from orphans and widows. Mr. Murphy," Judge Pemberton said sternly, "you will control yourself or be removed from these proceedings." "Then remove me," Murphy shot back, "because I won't sit here and watch you railroad a decent man while protecting a thief." The crowd erupted in voices, some supporting Murphy's outburst, others calling for order. In the chaos, Josiah saw Nora slip from her seat and make her way toward the front of the room, David's military medal clutched in her small fist. When she reached the makeshift witness area, she turned to face the crowd with a composure that silenced the room. "Your Honor," she said in a clear, strong voice, "I have something to say about my grandpa and about Mr. Webb." Judge Pemberton looked flustered. "Child, this is not appropriate." "I think it is," Nora replied firmly. "Since you're all talking about what's best for me, maybe you should hear what I think." Nora stood before the packed saloon with the quiet dignity of someone far older than her 9 years. In her small hands, she held David's military medal, its bronze surface catching the light from the oil lamps that illuminated the makeshift courtroom. "My papa earned this medal for bravery," she began, her voice carrying clearly to every corner of the room. "He died serving this territory, trying to make it a better place for families like ours. And my mama worked every day of her life to take care of me and to save money for my future." She turned to look directly at Judge Pemberton. "You say my grandpa isn't fit to care for me because he lived alone for a long time. But do you know why he lived alone? Because his heart was broken when he thought his whole family was dead. That's not crazy. That's love that hurt so much he didn't know how to bear it." Murmurs of sympathy rippled through the crowd, and Josiah felt tears stinging his eyes as he watched his granddaughter defend him with such grace and wisdom. "When I was living on the streets, hungry and cold and scared, where were all these people who are so worried about me now?" Nora continued, her voice growing stronger. "Where was Mr. Webb when I was digging through garbage for food? Where was Judge Pemberton when I had nowhere to sleep?" She paused, letting the questions hang in the air before answering them herself. "They were nowhere. But my grandpa found me, and he took me home, and he's been taking care of me ever since. He teaches me things, and he listens to my stories, and he makes sure I have enough to eat and a warm place to sleep." Webb shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his earlier confidence beginning to crack under the steady gaze of a child who had seen through his manipulation. "Mr. Webb says he was trying to help my family," Nora said, turning toward him. "But helpers don't steal money that belongs to children. Helpers don't lie about expenses that never happened. Helpers don't try to take someone's grandpa away when that's the only family they have left." She held up David's medal so everyone could see it. "This medal represents honor and service and sacrifice. My papa died believing that good people would take care of his family after he was gone. My mama died trusting that the money she saved would be used to give me a better future." Her voice began to shake slightly, but she pressed on. "Mr. Webb broke that trust. He stole from my mama, and he would have kept stealing if my grandpa hadn't been brave enough to stop him. That's not the behavior of someone who helps people. That's the behavior of someone who takes advantage of people who can't fight back." The room was absolutely silent now, everyone hanging on her words. Even Judge Pemberton seemed affected by her testimony, his stern expression softening as he looked at the courageous child standing before him. "You want to know if my grandpa is a good guardian?" Nora asked, her voice growing firm again. "He risked everything to get my inheritance back from someone who stole it. He's learning to be part of a community again because he knows I need to. Be around other people. He reads to me every night, and he's teaching me how to carve wood like my papa used to do." She walked over to where Josiah sat, her small hand finding his larger one. "Most importantly, he loves me. Not because he has to, not because some court told him to, but because I'm his family, and family takes care of each other." Sheriff Callahan stood up from his seat, a thick folder in his hands. "Your Honor, while we've been debating Mr. Hartwell's fitness as a guardian, I've been investigating the allegations against Mr. Webb. I have here documented evidence of fraudulent estate management affecting 17 families over the past 5 years. He moved to the front of the room, opening the folder to reveal bank records, forged receipts, and testimony from multiple victims. The evidence shows a clear pattern of theft and deception, targeting the most vulnerable members of our community: widows, orphans, elderly settlers without family to protect them. Judge Pemberton's face had gone pale as he examined the documents. Sheriff Callahan presented. The weight of evidence was overwhelming, and even his loyalty to Webb couldn't overcome the clear proof of systematic fraud. Webb himself seemed to crumble as the reality of his exposure settled over him. The smooth confidence was gone, replaced by the desperate look of a man whose carefully constructed world was collapsing around him. Furthermore, Sheriff Callahan continued, I have here signed statements from citizens of Cedar Ridge attesting to Mr. Hartwell's character and his excellent care of his granddaughter. The notion that this man is unfit to be a guardian is not supported by any credible evidence. Doc Morrison stood up to add his support. As the child's physician, I can testify that Nora has received excellent care under her grandfather's guardianship. She's healthy, happy, and clearly thriving in his care. One by one, other community members rose to speak on Josiah's behalf. Murphy talking about his honesty in business dealings, several neighbors describing his helpfulness and reliability, and even some of the women who had initially been skeptical, admitting that they had been wrong about his fitness as a guardian. As the testimony mounted in his favor, Josiah felt something he hadn't experienced in 15 years. The warm embrace of a community that had chosen to accept and support him. These people, many of whom he barely knew, were standing up for him and Nora because it was the right thing to do. Judge Pemberton surveyed the evidence before him, the testimony he had heard, and the faces of the community members who had made their position clear. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a gravity that silenced the room completely. Based on the evidence presented today, I find no grounds for removing Nora Hartwell from her grandfather's care. Furthermore, I am ordering a full investigation into Mr. Webb's business practices, and I am recommending that the territorial authorities pursue criminal charges for fraud and theft. The room erupted in cheers and applause as Nora threw her arms around Josiah's neck, both of them crying with relief and joy. Justice had been served, family had been preserved, and a community had remembered what it meant to protect those who needed protection most. Christmas Eve, 1880, exactly 1 year after Josiah first found Nora behind Murphy's saloon. Snow was falling again, but this time it felt like a blessing rather than a burden, blanketing the mountain in pristine white that sparkled in the lamplight, streaming from the cabin windows. Inside, the space had been transformed beyond recognition from the sparse, functional dwelling it had been a year ago. Nora's influence was everywhere. In the colorful quilts that Anna would have loved, in the books scattered on tables alongside Josiah's woodworking projects, in the family photographs that now held places of honor on the mantelpiece. The most prominent addition was a new family Bible, its leather binding still fresh and unmarked, except for the careful entries Josiah had made in his neat handwriting. Nora's adoption had been officially recorded there, along with the restoration of her father's military honors and her rightful place in the Hartwell family line. "Grandpa," Nora called from where she sat by the fire, carefully wrapping a small package in brown paper. "Do you think Papa and Mama can see us from heaven?" "I believe they can," Josiah replied, looking up from the rocking chair he was finishing for her birthday next month. "And I think they're very proud of how brave and strong you've been this year." The intervening months had brought remarkable changes to both their lives. Nora was attending the local school now, where she had quickly established herself as one of the brightest students. Her teacher, Miss Harrison, often commented on her maturity and compassion, noting how she helped younger children and showed patience with those who struggled with their lessons. For Josiah, the transformation had been even more dramatic. The man who had lived as a hermit for 15 years had gradually become an integral part of the Cedar Ridge community. He served on the school board now, used his carpentry skills to help neighbors with construction projects, and had even begun attending Sunday services at the small church where Anna was buried. The resolution of Webb's crimes had taken months. To fully untangle The man himself had been sentenced to 5 years in territorial prison, and his ill-gotten gains had been redistributed to his victims as much as possible. 17 families had recovered money and property that had been stolen from them, and new regulations had been put in place to prevent similar frauds in the future. "The package is for you," Nora said, approaching with the small wrapped gift. "It's not much, but I made it myself." Josiah accepted the present with the reverence he had learned to show for Nora's gifts. Inside the wrapping was a small wooden carving. A bear standing on its hind legs, carved with surprising skill for someone so young. "I've been working on it during my free time at school," she explained. "Miss Harrison helped me with the difficult parts, but I did most of it myself. Do you like it?" "It's beautiful," Josiah said, and meant it. The carving showed real artistic promise, and he could see echoes of his own technique in her work. "You have your father's hands and your great-grandmother's eye for detail. Will you teach me more about wood carving? I want to learn all the things Papa would have taught me if he'd lived." "I'll teach you everything I know," Josiah promised. "And when you've learned all I can show you, we'll find someone who can teach you even more." They sat together by the fire, sharing the comfortable silence that had become natural between them. Outside, the wind sang through the pine trees, carrying with it the scent of snow and the promise of spring still months away. "Grandpa," Nora said eventually, "are you happy now?" The question was simple but profound, cutting to the heart of everything that had changed in their lives. Was he happy? For 15 years, happiness had seemed like an impossibility, a luxury. He had forfeited when he chose isolation over the risk of further loss. "Yes," he said, surprising himself with the certainty in his voice. "I am happy, are you?" "Very happy," she replied without hesitation. "I have a family again, and a home, and people who care about me. I have my inheritance back, so I can go to college someday if I want to. And I have you." She curled up against his side, small and warm and trusting, and Josiah felt the last of his carefully constructed walls crumble away. This child had saved him as surely as he had saved her that Christmas Eve a year ago. She had reminded him that love was worth the risk of loss, that family was worth fighting for, that community was stronger than isolation. "Do you know what I learned this year?" Nora asked sleepily. "What's that?" "That love doesn't make you weaker when you give it away. It makes you stronger. And families aren't just the people you're born to. They're the people who choose to love you no matter what." Her words carried the wisdom of someone who had lost everything and found it again, who had learned at a young age that the most precious things in life couldn't be bought or stolen. They could only be given and received freely. As the fire burned down to glowing coals, and the snow continued to fall outside, Josiah held his granddaughter close and thought about the year that had passed. 12 months ago, he had been a broken man living in exile from everything that mattered. Tonight, he was surrounded by warmth, love, and the promise of many more Christmases to come. In the morning, they would attend church services together, sharing Christmas dinner with Doc Morrison and his wife, and several other families who had become part of their extended community. There would be laughter and stories, the exchange of modest gifts, and the deep satisfaction that came from being part of something larger than themselves. But for now, it was enough to sit quietly in their warm cabin, grandfather and granddaughter, watching the snow fall and counting their blessings. They had found each other in the darkness of a Christmas Eve, two lost souls who had discovered that family was not something you were born into, but something you chose to build together, one day at a time, with love and patience and hope. Outside, the mountain slept under its blanket of snow, peaceful and eternal. Inside, the Hartwell family was home at last.